morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is slavery and how the word slavery has become synonymous with African Americans, Black Africans, and Black people all over the world. And this is in relation to a segment that I did some weeks ago when I talked about the natives of the so-called Middle East, a term that was coined by an American captain, naval captain, by the name of Alfred Mahan in 1902. And out of that, we all know Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Persia, Yemen, and all those places today as Middle East. But prior to that, these places were all called Northeastern of Africa. And thousands of years ago also, before the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia and that part of the world was part joint of Africa. So I talked about how the natives of Saudi Arabia, which was originally the desert inhabited by different tribes, and some of these tribes were of African origin, and not because of slavery or the slave trade between the East Africans and the Sultanates of the Middle East about thousands years ago, around the 8th and 9th century AD. And in that segment, there were some comments and some people were saying that no, most of the blacks or the Africans that you see in these areas, the so-called Middle East, came there because of slavery, which I beg to differ. Because even if you look at the geographic location of Saudi Arabia, and you look at where Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, all the way down to Tanzania, and the only division between these places now is the Red Sea, you can understand why these areas were also inhabited by Black Africans long before the Jews went expelled from Jerusalem, as well as the Turks when they invaded, and the Persians came down and settled within these main parts of what is today Saudi Arabia, Persia, Iraq, Yemen, and so on and so forth. And this notion that somehow that every African or Black person that are inhabitants of countries outside of Africa have to be brought there by slaves is what I have issue with. And this notion goes with this inferiority and superiority mindset that is being associated, especially the inferiority mindset associated with Africans and Black people, that the only way these Blacks have to be somewhere else outside of Africa have to be that they were brought there because of the slave trade. When in fact, if you look at the history of slavery tells you that the word slave comes out of the word Slav. And Slav means slave. But it came out of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire conquered most of Europe and conquered some part of Asia, all the way to what we call today Middle East. But specifically with Europe, when they took the Slavs as slaves, when we talk about the Slavs, which is today's Baltic, which is Serbia, eastern Russia, part of Europe, which is Russia, Slovenia, Serbia, and all those areas, all the way to Poland, and even part of France and Germany. These were all controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And this Ottoman Empire conquering of merely Europe also took slaves from these Baltic areas. So the word slave comes from Slav, which is the people that lived around that area around that time. So if you look at the history of slavery outside of what we know about slavery in terms of going back to the beginning of humanity, slaves have always existed regardless of what we know of slavery today. It's been part of human life ever since humanity and ever since man have been on this planet. But when we talk about this modern day slavery, it is now mainly associated with this African American, Black Africans, and Black people all over the world because of the modern day transatlantic slavery. And it comes out of it also because of the inferiority complex that most of these people around the world have on Black Africans and other Blacks as inferior. And out of Blacks and Africans being inferior, that is why they were enslaved. But this notion and narrative is very false because Africans also ended up enslaving Europeans, which I know a lot of people will be surprised about it. But if you look at the history of the Moors, the Black Moors, who were mainly people of Senegalese and Mauritania and some part of West Africa, having converted to Islam, joined with the Arabs and invaded Spain and Portugal, and then ruled Spain and Portugal for about 700 years. When these Moors ruled Spain, Portugal, and part of Rome for 700 years, they were the ones that also brought education and mainly civilization to that part of Europe, and mainly Europe. And out of that, when they were driven out of Spain, on their way back to Africa, when they settled mainly in the northern part of Africa, they brought with them white European slaves as well. They brought with them a lot of white European slaves. As a matter of fact, quite recently, an European talked about close to more than almost 1.25 to 2 million whites slaves were brought by these Muslims and the African Moors to northern part of Africa, where they settled in Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, part of Egypt, as well as some part of Chad today. So if you look at the issue of slavery, the African slaves that the Ottoman Empire, the Arabs, dealt with in terms of the slave trading with the Eastern African countries at that time were also mainly the ones that settled all the way to Turkey, as well as part of the Middle East, Persia, Afghanistan, Iraq. But there are also natives of Africans that were there long before Islam and long before Saudi Arabia, as we know today, became Saudi Arabia, which was put together by the founder, Mohammed bin Saud, and founded Saudi Arabia in the mid-1930s after fighting among the tribes. Because Saudi Arabia, as we know today, was mainly tribal all along the desert. They were mainly tribal. And some of these tribes were the natives of African origin. And out of bin Saud negotiating with these tribes, was able to put these tribes together and ended up founding of Saudi Arabia in the mid-1930s. So this notion that for Africans to be somewhere or Black people to somewhere outside of Africa, they have to be slaves sent there is false. It's false. And I mean, looking at even the Americas, I mean, if you ever heard of the Columbus, Africans Before Columbus, a book written by Ivan van Sertima, in which he documented even within the Americas and even within the Spaniards and the Portuguese that first came to the Americas, and their encounter with the Native Americans, who told them that the Africans had already sailed across the Atlantic thousands of years before they came there. And these are all found in the journals of Christopher Columbus, as well as the other Spanish explorers around that time. So if you look at the word slave, it started with the Slavs in the Baltic regions of Eastern Europe. So these were slaves that were taken all over Europe. So Europeans had slaves. They had white slaves all over Europe. Millions of Europeans enslaved each other. Remember, the world as you see today, the map of the world that you see today is not the map of the world thousands of years ago. Let's say even 1,000 years ago. Just like Asia. I mean, when you go to, let's say, Japan, the Japanese were trading in slaves of Japanese women and children and men with the Portuguese. The Portuguese bought Japanese slaves. And some of these Japanese slaves that were bought by the Portuguese were brought to the Americas, Argentina, as well as Peru. So you see some Japanese who have become part of the natives of the Americas. They are not natives, but part of the Americas. Most of these people were brought there by as slaves. But you see, you don't hear a lot of this talk about these slaves that were trading, that was going on outside of the African or the black people that were brought here as slaves. Now you hear about black people and it becomes synonymous with inferiority. The idea that these blacks were enslaved, the idea that they became slaves because they were inferior. So it's like a shame with other races when they talk about, oh, their people were also enslaved. Because, see, in the purview of the white supremacy mindset, they wouldn't want you to know that Africans, the African Moors, the black Moors, also enslaved Europeans that they brought to Africa. Because that goes against the white supremacy mindset, that the white European was the one who basically controlled everything. So if you know the history that Africans, Moors, also enslaved Europeans, white Europeans, and brought them to Africa, that goes against that notion. But looking at the slavery institution itself, you find out that it wasn't about race. It was more about economic issues. Because most of the African slaves that were sold to these Arabs around the 8th and 9th century, when the Arab African slave trade of East Africa was taking place, were mainly people that had been captured out of tribal wars between other African tribes. Same with Europe, same with Asia. Most of the slaves that were sold by the Japanese, and most of them that were sold by the Chinese as well as the Koreans, because the Koreans were sold as slaves by the Japanese. And some of the Chinese were also sold as slaves by the Japanese. Same as with the Chinese, the Cambodians. I mean, all these people were sold because of, they were what? War prisoners, prisoners of war. And out of that, they were sold to these slave traders to be sent and used as slaves. So if you look at the economics of slavery, it was more about business than out of racism. You know, maybe racism might have played a role later. But if you look at it, it was merely in the business mindset, it was the best business decision for a businessman to make in terms of looking at the labor cost and all of that stuff. But outside of all of that, this notion that the blacks and the Africans were inferior, out of that, their inferiority mindset, that is why they had to be enslaved, is been debunked by the fact that the word slave came from the Slavs, who were white Europeans, who were enslaved by the Ottoman Turks. So if the Ottoman Turks enslaved Europeans, as a matter of fact, when the Ottoman Turks ruled pretty much all of Europe, before even right after the Mongols had already taken over Europe, mainly Europe and all of Asia, including China and all those. Only know about the history of Genghis Khan. They all had slaves that they were selling to various people all around that time in that area. So if you look at the issue of slavery and the term slavery and all that stuff, you have to understand this had nothing to do with inferiority. This had more to do with business mindset of the people at the time. And also being the fact that if you take a slave, it also shows the possession of wealth around that time. So fellas, this is a very short video. And I'm doing this video in response to that notion that all Africans that you see outside of Africa have to be on the other continents or other places out of slavery, which is false. Because if you look at slavery existed thousands and thousands of years long before other foreigners came to Africa to enslave Africans. So fellas, that is all I have for you guys today. If it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys and have a great week. Thank you and peace and love.